Well, again, welcome, and so great to see all of you here today. We're really excited about today's presentation and excited you could be here to join us. So my name is Mike Winters. I'm the chair of the Cultural Heritage Board, and it is my honor to be here to introduce our guest speaker. Today's presentation is the next part in the Cultural Heritage Board speaker series titled A Shared History, Diverse Voices Across Ventura County. The intent of the series is to promote meaningful public humanities, learning, and community dialogue focused on traditionally underrepresented voices and stories and their contribution to Ventura County's history. Part of the Cultural Heritage Board's role is working to help educate the community and share information on the county's historic resources, including those that are socially and culturally important. Today's event is the second part in the series, which will continue through the end of the year and into next spring. These sessions will feature scholars and local voices that are interested or that are intended to create space for questions and dialogue to foster understanding within the community. All of our sessions will be recorded for later viewing. And I'd like to introduce at this time our vice chair, Mr. Miguel Fernandez, to go ahead and tell us a little bit about our speaker.
Thank you, Mike, and my apologies for walking in just now. So today, Dr. José M. Alamillo will speak on the history of farm worker labor camps and farm worker movements in Ventura County. By way of background, Dr. José M. Alamillo is currently professor of Chicana studies at California State University, Channel Islands. He received his PhD in comparative cultures from University of California, Irvine, and is an expert in Mexican-American cultural history with a focus on labor, immigration, gender, leisure, and sports. He is the author of Making Lemonade Out of Lemons, Mexican-American Labor and Leisure in a California Town, which was published in 2006, and co-author of Latinos in U.S. Sport, A History of Isolation, Cultural Identity, and Acceptance, published in 2011. And author of Deportes, The Making of a Sporting Mexican Diaspora in 2020. He is currently working on two research projects, the first being Dark Waters, Floods, Ethnic Mexicans, and the Politics of Disaster Relief along the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. And this book will examine the relationships between disaster relief organizations and ethnic Mexican communities in the aftermath of flood disasters in Southern California, Arizona, Colorado, and Texas. And the second project is Untold Legacies, Reinterpreting Ventura County History through an Ethnic Studies Lens. The edited book will bring together scholarly essays, testimonials, and creative expressions that center subjugated histories and knowledges of racially minoritized communities in Ventura County. So with that, everyone please welcome Dr. Alamillo.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So thank you, Dylan, for inviting me, the Ventura County Cultural Heritage Board. Really excited to be here. I wanted to share with you a little bit of some of the research that I've been working with my students at Cal State Channel Islands, where I'm currently a professor. I want to begin, though, that this is not my first time being here at the County Government Center. Summer of 1983, my first summer job was here at the clerk's office. And, with youth employment office, you have those opportunities, right, to figure out how to find a job that you want to do in the future. And I was one of those, little kids who was looking for a summer job, and I got, hired here at the clerk's office. And my job was microfilming death certificates. And so I think, though, they didn't like me that much because I kept reading the death certificates instead of microfilming them. But I think that became an interest for me in history. And so that's how I became really a historian interested in local history. So I just wanted to share that with you. So that's really my first visit to this area. Oh, great. So I'm going to go ahead and start my presentation. So a little bit about myself. I was born in Cueva Grande, Zacatecas, Mexico, and one of 6 children. And my family, had deep roots here in the county, even though we came here in the 1970s. My grandfather had lived here in Santa Paula during the 1920s, and so he shares stories about this area. And it's one of the reasons why my family relocated here in the 1970s. So you see there in the middle is my family and then my grandparents. And then we ended up living in Limonera del Mar. And so if you know Limonera del Mar, if you happen to see it, you might miss it. It's actually off Telegraph Road between Victoria and Kimball. And that's really our home here, and it's a company home. So if you're employed by Limonera Company, you know that you actually have to work there in order to, have a house. So that's my growing up experience. We lived there until the 1980s. My mother worked in the packing house at the Montalvo packing house, and my dad picked lemons for Limonera Company for several years. And it wasn't until 1981 that they were going to convert that whole neighborhood or the whole ranch. We called it El Ranchito. It's sort of a little ranch. And part of it is because I think my parents, it reminded them of like the small village in Mexico, right? So they were going to convert it into retirement homes. So they essentially told the residents, okay, you need to find a new place. So we had to scramble and find a new house. And so we ended up moving there to East Ventura, next door to Carrillo Village. So my parents are still there. But that's really my upbringing is living in a farm labor camp, and one of those historic labor camps. And so if you go back in history, we know that in Ventura County, we've had many different types of labor camps. We've had, for example, bunkhouses, right, in Rancho Sespe. And so these were labor camps primarily for single, unoccupied males that were here working for maybe a short temporary period, to family housing in Limonera Ranch in Santa Paula. And so that's another example of the long history of Limonera Ranch here in the county. And then we also have Filipino workers in Arneo Ranch in Camarillo. And that's one of the research that my colleague who's been doing research in Filipino farm workers in the county. That's another legacy there that's really fascinating. And it was a temporary camp, primarily working in the peas. So there was a pea harvest in which they were brought in from LA, and they lived in that Arneo Ranch for several months. And then the factory labor camp, of course, in Oxnard. And of course, we know the factory, right, the American Sugar Beet Factory, right, has had a long history of bringing in family laborers and essentially providing housing for them. So we know that when we think about camps, we tend to have this connotation of camps as being sort of a transient and temporary form of community. But in fact, we've known that these camps have long settled families and have really found their home in these camps. And so a great example of that, if you look at one other camp, is in 1936, the Sadako and Lemon Association camp, essentially housed about 100 single men, and then they brought in their families. Ultimately, it became what we know today as Carrillo Village, right? And so we know Carrillo Village, it's not a camp, it's a village, right? But part of it is because, these residents, once you have families, they really make them into an entire neighborhood in which they feel a sense of belonging, and they have extended family, maybe relatives move in. And so we see over time that often association camps, what we usually call them, if they're part of a farm labor association, really become thriving communities and villages, right, that actually have an extensive network in which families, help each other and live off, the agricultural jobs of either their fathers or their brothers. So one of the first, events in Ventura County history that I want to talk about is the 1941 citrus strike. On February 25th, 1941, citrus workers went on strike, and they had help from the American Federation of Labor, the Agriculture and Citrus Workers Local 22342, and there's a button there. You can kind of see it. And so they were really fighting for higher wages, 30 to 40 cents an hour, better working conditions, and compensation for the waiting time because often they had to wait for the moisture to basically dissipate, right? And once that happens, then they can start picking, but they weren't paid for that. So that was a grievance. And then, of course, they wanted union recognition. And so they went on strike, and it was a 6-month strike. Over 2,500 up to 3,500 workers went on strike, and they basically were out on strike for about 6 months. And what's interesting about this photo is I want to show you is that the only place where they actually can congregate and meet was on the ballpark. So it's actually a photo of Haydock Park where the Oxnard Aces baseball team played. And you can see that's where they're gathering. There you have a picket line in Briggs Lemon Association, packing house, and then the corrido, which is a fascinating, folk ballad about the strike. And this was actually a corrido that was shared by me that talks about the strike that took place. And what's also really interesting about, and why I'm sharing this, is that what happened when workers are now go on strike and they live in farm labor housing? Well, they're evicted. And so we see the mass eviction of these camp families from labor camps. And what you see here is a photograph of families that had to essentially create their own tent communities. And so they would rename them after the Hoovervilles of the 1930s. And so here you have a photo of Teagueville, named after Charles C. Teague, who was the owner and, a big, important agricultural leader in this area, but also in California and nationwide. He essentially basically gets the title of Teagueville, right, in one of those tent colonies. And then here below, you see a photograph, and that's, I believe, in Kimball. And Kimball was another tent colony that the families had to find, shelter, right? They had to create on their own. And then, of course, the government steps in. And so a lot of people don't know that the government stepped in to actually help with relief of these migrant families, especially when there was, a big need. And here you have Farm Security Administration's labor camp in El Rio. When you look at that history of El Rio camp, is you find that it was a little bit different from the other tent colonies in which they were very temporary. They had to figure out where to go next. Well, in the FSA camp, essentially, because it was federal government, running the camp, they actually had, their own city council. They had, their branch library. They had actually a boxing ring. And then they actually provided like a workshop for some of the residents, adult males, to learn how to carpentry. So this FSA camp was sort of a kind of an experiment in democracy, and it was a sort of a miniature city. And there's a lot of information you can look into the history. There's a book by my colleague Veronica Martinez Matsuda titled Migrant Citizenship, in which she actually goes into these FSA camps. And Ventura County was one of those, right, that actually had this fascinating FSA camp. And if you know a little bit about the FSA, it's a New Deal agency, really, that comes out of, Franklin Roosevelt, and it was really to provide relief for migrant workers, especially when you had the Dust Bowl, right? And so a lot of migrants were coming from the Midwest seeking relief. And so this is an example of a FSA camp that really needs more, I think, attention into that history. Then right after the strike, because ultimately the strike fails, the FSA camp only lasts about 3 months at the most. And so right at the end of 41, then we see 1942, we see the beginnings of the Bracero program. And of course, we know the Bracero program, begins, as a wartime emergency agreement between Mexico and the US. And it's really bringing in, workers to offset the labor shortage, because many of them have gone off to fight in the war. And so what we see is a farm labor supply that essentially lasts all the way until 1964. What's interesting in doing this research about the Bracero program here locally is that this county was one of the largest receivers of braceros. So if we look at about 5 million that were imported in the United States, about 20% were contracted to work here in Ventura County. And that's really significant. When we actually look at who were the actual employers, we found about 185 employers that contracted braceros. And the peak year was really in the 50s, mid-50s, is where we see the largest coming in, about 6,000 to 7,000 here coming into Ventura County. And so the largest contractor of the braceros, right, were the Ventura County Citrus Growers Committee, and that was their primary contractor of braceros. And they were really charged with recruitment, with transporting them, housing them, and establishing a wage rate for them. And I'm sharing this photo on the top because this is a photo that was shared by me by Carlos Avila, who is a photographer. And he shares with me that this was actually very common, that they would have these cuadrillas or crews, right, in which they would actually have braceros from the same region work together. And this is a cuadrilla from Jalisco, 1955. And I don't know that much about who these workers were, but I think there's more research that could be done on who exactly these were. It was run by this contractor named Rudy, and it's interesting because he's actually on the left and on the right. I'm not sure why he's on both. So I'm trying to figure that out still. And then the Mica card, which is a kind of an employment card that was given to braceros, was by Gregorio. This was the one for Gregorio Montes, and he's the one that actually donated or brought the photograph to Carlos to get it, polished and restored. And so that's really his Mica card. So I'm trying to find out more information about this, but. Again, I want to talk about what happens when you have bracero program, with 20,000 coming in. We found about 165 bracero camps in Ventura County, but we were only able to document about 25 to 30. And so when we started this partnership with the Smithsonian, we had the exhibit here at Cal State Channel Islands in 2010. A lot of my students did all this research for the labor camps of braceros, and pretty much every city in Ventura County had at least 2 to 3 labor camps, some much more. I think many of them were very temporary, and some of them were very small, and it was really hard to actually find documentation for them. We used all kinds of sources. We used newspapers, archives, and many other kinds of primary sources. But you'll see here the sort of a few photos of the exhibit. And that actual bed and closet we actually got from the Piru labor camp. So when we did research with the Piru labor camp, we found some interesting information on that. That Piru labor camp started in 1950, and it housed about 250 braceros who lived there throughout the entire 22 years. And it was actually run by Nacho Guevara and his wife Mary. And here's a photo of Nacho cooking for some of these workers. So they kept actually running that Piru labor camp even after the bracero program. And we had a chance to interview Mary and document this labor camp. And one of the things that my students did on campus is we wanted to figure out a way to, give a history of this camp, because we knew that it was going to be demolished. By then it was going to become a farm worker housing. So we partnered with Carrillo Economic Development to basically put together an exhibit. And so I don't know if you ever had a chance to visit the farm worker community called Valle Naranjal. That's where you'll find our exhibit. And what we wanted to document was how this family, the Guevaras, ran the camp, because it was very different from other camps. They really tried to meet the needs of a lot of the workers. They cooked for them, especially Mexican food, which they would miss, especially if they're very, very homesick. And we also did a replica of the actual camp, so you can kind of see there's a replica of the actual camp. We did a timeline. You'll see my students hanging up the timeline. And that's what it looks like today. And then, of course, there's a mural as well. So that's one way that we can kind of ensure that that history, right, is not lost, right, by partnering with community organizations and seeing if there's a way that we can, do an exhibit like we did with Piru Labor Camp. We also wanted to do a partnership with another camp that I want to talk about, and that's the Buena Vista camp. And the Buena Vista Labor Camp is important because it's, I don't know if you pass on 5th Street and Rose, but it's 1068 East 5th Street if you ever want to, check it out. But you still see that exact dining hall there to this day on the corner of Buena Vista and 5th Street. It's next door to what Triple S Camp and then what was once there Pacific Camp. And if you look at this article and if you read it, it's actually talks about how it's one of the largest labor camp in the nation in the city of Oxnard. And the reason is because it housed between 5,000 to 7,000 at one point. This camp was built by the CNM Properties. These were the Malhar family and the Carty family. These were prominent ranch families in the city of Oxnard. And it had dormitories, living quarters, it had a mess hall, kitchen, recreation center, sanitary facilities. That dining hall is about like 180 long and 80 wide. So it's a pretty sizable dining hall that's still there. And I noticed that when I was looking at your website, all the points of interest, historical interest in the city of Oxnard, it's where that little arrow is, because we know that there's a historic area in Oxnard, but I think this would be a great candidate, right, for a historical landmark of some kind. And I think that's why I want to share a little bit about what we did with research in this camp. We got a chance to research and interview some of the former residents or people that worked there. And we interviewed, for example, Mr. Isaias de Arcos. He worked really closely with one of the managers, and that's Fidel Villaseñor. And if you know a little bit about the Villaseñor family, they actually managed quite a few labor camps in the county. They actually start out, as a family that owns a restaurant, El Tapatio from Fillmore. They closed the restaurant when they realized, there's a big need to serve and feed the Bracero family, the Braceros who are here. So they get contracted, right, by the Ventura County Farm Labor Association to actually run camps in Somis, Fillmore, Santa Paula, Moore Park in the Simi Valley, and Tapo. And essentially, what they do, what's really interesting, is they begin to hire Mexican chefs, right, to cook, bake for the workers. And so by preparing these culturally relevant meals, right, they're going to make them feel a little bit more, at home and so forth. So this is what they end up doing. And also, it becomes a model camp for other farm labor associations. So here is an article about delegates coming to visit the model camp, right? And so the other person that becomes part of the Buena Vista is Hector Zamora. And Hector Zamora is interesting because he's basically the manager of the Ventura County Farm Labor Association. And what he does is that he actually works with the farmers to go to Mexico and recruit these braceros, because in the very beginning of the program, there was this rumor going on that, you don't want to go to the U.S. because if you get contracted, you might have to go and fight in the war. And so there was a lot of rumors going on. So we didn't get a lot of braceros the first year. So he goes to kind of dispel that rumor. And so he begins to recruit braceros. But part of recruiting braceros, right, is to ensure that they're not going to be sent off to fight a war, but actually, get treated with respect and with dignity. And so that's what he does, right? He works with the Farm Labor Association closely to do that. But it wasn't always ideal. Now, here's another photo of Lamberto Garcia. And Lamberto Garcia was another former bracero who we got a chance to interview. And so he shared his story of his brother who becomes a cook at Buena Vista. That's a photograph of his brother, Joaquin. And that's me right there interviewing him with Mr. De Arcos and the other, and then David Garcia, who's here in the audience right there. He's also with me. And so we got a chance to talk about, you know, how was it, you know, working for the labor camp? And, you know, you got to understand that as a bracero, you're working pretty much 7 days out of the week. Your only day off is Sunday. So what do you do on Sunday? Well, you could go to church. You could play ball. You can go to the movie theater, el teatro, right, on the boulevard. And so that's what a lot of them did for recreation. And that's a photo of my student, Rafael, who got a chance to interview Mr. De Arcos. But yeah, Lamberto talked a lot about, you know, him coming to visit his brother. He stayed, he worked for the Buena Vista camp, but eventually, you know, he found a job at a furniture store. But he also, you know, had a chance to play ball and play baseball. And so he formed a team once he got settled. The other thing is he met his future wife, who was a Mexican-American from this area. So it became an opportunity for braceros, right, to maybe, you know, meet a future wife, you know. I mean, one of the things about, and that's unique, I think, about Buena Vista is unlike other bracero camps that were isolated in rural areas or desert areas, this was located in a thriving city with a Mexican-American community that they could, you know, get to know, or they could meet a prospective wife. And so that's what happened to a lot of the braceros. But they weren't always treated with respect and well-liked. And so we also see how there were problems. So here's a photo of Lamberto in his baseball uniform and his car. He would, you know, drive around with his car. And the Buena Vista team, they formed a soccer team. Once they figured out that a lot of the braceros, you know, they were into soccer, not baseball. And so they formed a soccer team. And they were really good. They would travel around the county. But they were limited in terms of where they could travel. They weren't allowed to go beyond Ventura County. In fact, they had to get special permission to travel to Santa Barbara County. And if they were denied, well, they had to stick to the county. The other important point that I want to highlight is that many of the braceros spend a lot of money locally, right? So, you know, they weren't just contained within the camp. They were also able to go and spend money in the restaurants, wherever they were, you know, allowed and served with respect and dignity. So there were problems, though, and I want to highlight a couple of them here. So one is that they were not allowed to dance. So 5 persons were arrested in a restaurant where there was ordinances about they were not allowed to dance in this restaurant. They were arrested for, you know, morals charge. We know what that is, right? There was prostitution. You know, there was a lot of beatings. Many of them were beaten up by Mexican Americans often that lived locally. So they weren't all, braceros were not all treated with respect and dignity. There were often conflicts and fights that would take place. Gambling, there was raids of gambling. And so, of course, there was, deaths as well. Whether it was, you know, a lot of them who got sick, you know, they died of health or injuries. So this article talks about one of the, you know, machine that essentially, you know, there was a tragic death, you know, accident in which he got trampled by a tractor. And, you know, sometimes when these camps were in violation because, you know, they weren't allowed to hire or some, you know, braceros to work with machines if they weren't, you know, trained. And so, and if they were, they could get cited, and ultimately they could get banned from bringing in more contract workers at their site. So those are a couple problems that would happen. Yeah, so the problems, of course, also were around like how they were treated. And so one of the things is that if they weren't paid the correct, you know, salary that they deserved, then they could maybe try to go to the Mexican Council, but the Mexican Council often would ignore their complaints. So they really didn't have a lot of, choices for many of them. They didn't have the ability to advocate on their behalf. So they were essentially in like prison-like camps in many of these bracero camps, with not a lot of freedom. It was very limited in terms of where they could go. We also had a chance to interview Samuel Camacho, and Samuel Camacho is also really important here locally because he, comes in, he's from Jalisco, comes in at the age of 14, and he actually is a baker, right? So he gets employed to be a baker. First, he starts out as a bracero in Anaheim, and then he moves to work here for the Buena Vista camp. And then over time, he becomes a chef, and then he works at the Pacific Labor Camp, the Buena Vista Camp, and the Triple S. He ultimately purchases the Triple S Labor Camp, and he then runs the Triple S Labor Camp. Part of the reason is because he felt like he wanted to do things differently and treat the workers differently, because he remembers as a bracero how he was treated. So he begins to, one of the things he does is that he actually builds a shrine of the Virgen Guadalupe. Because religion was very important. Many of them who were homesick, right, needed religion. So he allowed for the, not only the pastor to come and administer and, but also for, have a actual shrine dedicated to the Virgen Guadalupe. The cafeteria would serve more delicious food. And, he also built a basketball court and a baseball diamond because, again, recreation is really important, especially on Sundays, right, where you have the day off. And so here's a photo of him. He's, getting ready there. I think they were going to do some kind of recreational. And then there's a photo of him with a demolished, because eventually they demolished the Buena Vista camp. And so that's a photo of the Buena Vista camp where they're demolishing the dormitories. But only the dining hall is left. So I just want to highlight how this dining hall that's still there, has the possibility, right, of being a historical landmark. And I think one of the ways that I'm envisioning is that a while back, when I brought up this idea to Carmen Ramirez, the late Carmen Ramirez, when she was the city council of Oxnard, we discussed the possibility of the city of Oxnard, working to make it, a historical landmark, and use that maybe as a local museum of braceros or for educational purposes. So there's also a precedent, because I knew in Texas, in fact, a couple years ago, the Mellon Foundation just gave about $750,000 to convert what was once a bracero processing center in Rio Vista to make it a bracero museum in Socorro, Texas. So there are possibilities of perhaps finding grants or funding for such a project of converting this into a kind of educational museum of some kind. So my hope, that it becomes an eligible for a Ventura County landmark, because I think it does merit, right, a historical, significance in this area. So yeah, so I just wanted to, and then here are photos of my students, what they did with the research, and a lot of them actually took the lessons in the history and the findings of that research to the classroom. So they're actually giving a lesson to Pacifica High School students on how to pick crops. So just so they, the teaching of the bracero program continues. A couple years ago, the state of California passed a law that was essentially to encourage high school teachers to teach about the bracero program, but it's recommended, it's not mandated. So my hope is that we'll continue to teach that locally in the history here. And then my students also raise money for a bracero student scholarship that to this day we give at our campus by selling t-shirts of braceros. So that was really cool. And we're still giving, that bracero scholarship to a descendant of being a bracero. So one of my projects, as it was mentioned earlier, is putting together a reader called Untold Legacies. And you can actually, if you scan the QR code, you can actually see the table contents of what's in there. We've been working hard on this, and it's really essentially it's local stories, local untold stories of marginalized communities. So we talk about African American communities in the county, Filipino Navy families, Japanese American, legacies here, especially the farmers who, are still to this day multi-generational farms, right, from the early Japanese workers, and of course the Bracero program, which will be part of this collection. So I just want to end it there. If you have any questions, comments.